Bonjour, Kinamagi and Nene Ireland Dijnakas, and welcome to this production of Social Studies Explorer. Today's episode, The Underground Railroad. A tour using Google Earth, the web version. And you might wonder, why are a lot of these dots located north of the Mason-Dixon line? And the Mason-Dixon line is what separates Pennsylvania and Maryland going north. But Mr. Ireland, wasn't slavery mostly down here? Well, yes. By the time we get into the 1800s, the bulk of slavery is located in our southern states. But freedom is not located in the southern states. Freedom was to the north, and quite frequently to our neighbors in Canada. So I wanted to run through this little montage here, put together by, I'm not sure who put it together, but credit to whoever they are. The Niagara River. The Niagara River separates New York from Ontario, Canada. That brings us right in here. You can see that it is possible to cross here. We're not talking Niagara Falls in a barrel. Talking the community of Niagara. Chloe Cooley was living in Canada when she was put on a boat to be sold across the river in America. This inspired the 1793 Act to Limit Slavery, which gave hope to those in northern states who then made their way to Canada. Chalmette Battlefield, Louisiana. During the War of 1812, slaves had heard stories about the British Army's promise to grant the black men who fought with them freedom. This bolstered Canada's reputation as a free territory, spurring more slaves to make the journey north, and the Underground Railroad swung into action. This monument commemorates the war's final major battle between the U.S. and Britain, the Battle of New Orleans. And if you're wondering what Canada and Louisiana have to do with each other, keep in mind at this time, Canada was a possession of the British Crown. So those who aided them, if they were to be given freedom, most likely it would be in Canada. Moving again to Wilmington Friends Meeting. This is Wilmington, Delaware, in a Quaker church. The railroad was not a network of trains and tunnels. Instead, the name referred to the secret routes that slaves took, mostly on foot or boat, and the people who helped. Quakers in many states were influential in the abolitionist movement. A few even helped slaves on their journeys north. This church in Wilmington, Delaware, counted Thomas Garrett as part of the congregation. Garrett assisted nearly 2,700 slaves on their journey to freedom. See the church right there. Moving to John Rankin House in Ripley, Ohio. Safe stops along the route were referred to as stations, while conductors were the people who guided slaves to freedom. John Rankin, a conductor, would light a lantern to signal it was safe for the slaves to cross the Ohio River and reach his home station. And the Ohio River separates Kentucky, which was a slave state, from Ohio, which was not. Although you might say, but Mr. Allen, I don't remember Kentucky fighting with the Confederacy. You're right, they didn't. They were a slave state that did not join the Confederacy. They stayed in the Union. And that's why the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually apply to slaves within that territory or state. Moving to Levi and Catherine Coffin's house, stations were well-kept secrets, often the homes of abolitionists who helped slaves reach the next stop. Levi Coffin's home was dubbed Grand Central Station after he and his wife helped countless slaves continue their journeys to the north. See, it's not a huge house, but doesn't mean there wasn't a good spot to hide in it. And in all of these cases, there had to be hiding spots. Our next stop on this little journey is in Dorchester County, Maryland, with the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park. I have to check this one out myself. A common misconception of their Underground Railroad is that it relied heavily on white abolitionists. In fact, some of the most active members were former slaves who chose to go back to the South to help free others. This park is named after Harriet Tubman, who was one of the most famous conductors. Now we're going to move into Ontario, Canada, Uncle Tom's Cabin historic site. You can see inside that this is not a huge cabin. As many homes in this time frame were not very large because you, had to heat it. And Ontario does get a little bit chilly. You might say, Mr. Ireland, this will kind of look like it was close to Michigan. It was. It's only a few hours drive from here in Mount Pleasant. But remember, the territory from Port Huron down to Detroit and when river narrows, that's an international border. So if you're going to like Walpole Island, you're actually in Canada and not the United States. Although Tom is a character in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, his story was inspired by the real-life abolitionist Reverend Josiah Henson. After being sold multiple times, he eventually escaped, using the Underground Railroad to find freedom. This museum is on the same site where he and his wife eventually lived. Let's pull up stakes here from Ontario and head to the Liberty Bell. Pennsylvania was an influential state in the abolitionist movement. Many slaves referred to it as the Promised Land, as many Underground Railroad activities were organized from here. The Liberty Bell that once rang from Pennsylvania State House became a symbol of the abolitionist movement because of its inscription, proclaim liberty throughout all the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. You're like, Mr. Ireland, I don't understand. The goal of abolitionists was to start actually providing liberty to our persons of color, particularly in this case with abolitionists, escaped slaves and slaves who were still bound to duty. Although that wouldn't still bring liberty to everyone. There's a way to go in our nation's history on that one. Now let's leave the Liberty Bell to the United States Senate in Washington, D.C. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was signed by the Senate in 1865. This banned slavery and marked the end of the line for the Underground Railroad. The Emancipation Proclamation issued prior to this only freed the slaves in states in rebellion. So slaves that were not part of the Confederacy were not freed during that proclamation. It required a constitutional amendment that isn't all that long ago. If you think about it, that's only 112 years before I was born. In fact, some people live to be that old. So it was quite likely that there were at least a few people born slaves that were still alive when I was. This makes you say, whoa. All right, our main text today came in your packets. It's from a magazine from Michigan History called The Mitten. It's a spring 2001 issue called The Underground Railroad. So you have this packet and you'll have a worksheet here. Some of the questions that you'll need to respond to will be in a Google form, but you're welcome to do a word search on your own for fun. Okay, the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad meant freedom for thousands of slaves in the South. The Underground Railroad was not a real railroad. It was a name given to the route of roads and homes used to help slaves escape from their southern masters. Many slaves escaped to the northern United States and Canada, where they could be free. Many slaves came to Michigan from Kentucky. You can see some of the paths right here. In fact, these paths very much resemble the highway system today. These were also paths that were well worn by Native Americans prior to this point. So it makes sense that this is the easiest way to travel. Although boats were also a very important tool on this. Escaping was dangerous. If they were caught, slaves were often whipped or beaten and made to wear chains. Many who made it to the north worked to help other slaves escape through the Underground Railroad. The routes they took were kept secret. Escaping slaves, or fugitives, traveled by foot, horse, train, or even fancy carriages. They often wore disguises. Railroad terms like depot and conductor were code words. In most towns in southern Michigan, there were conductors, or people who helped protect those running away from slavery. Slaves were hidden in homes or barns during the day. These places were called depots. At night, they went to a depot in the next town. Some of the slaves went to Canada. Some chose to stay in Michigan. You see, this would be a pretty large group. The more people you had, the more likely you were to be heard. So sometimes it might only be one family. The Crosswhites. Adam Crosswhite and his family escaped from slavery in Kentucky and settled near Marshall in Calhoun County. Adam feared that slave catchers from Kentucky might come to Michigan to take him and his family back. He told his neighbors of a signal he would use in case of danger. The signal was a shot fired from a gun. One morning in 1847, the neighbors heard the signal and ran to his house. At the door were 4 Kentucky men. They'd come to take the Crosswhites back to slavery. A group of 100 blacks and whites gathered at the house. They stopped the Kentuckians while Adam, his wife, and their 4 children escaped by train to Detroit and then to Canada. The Kentuckians were angry. They went to court. The Marshall people were charged with keeping them from taking back their legal property. The Marshall people had to pay money to the slave owners, but the Crosswhites were safe in Canada. In 1850, the United States passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This law strengthened an existing law that made it illegal for people to help slaves escape and allowed slave catchers to go to free states to find escaped slaves. Many people in Michigan disagreed with this law. So in 1855, Michigan passed another law that said state and local officials could not help slave catchers. The Underground Railroad ended when the Civil War started in 1861. I probably would have been one of those people that would have gotten in trouble for stopping slave catchers. It was originally the thought that if you made it to the north, you were safe. But that changed as the political power of the South made it necessary for the Congress to pass these kind of laws. One of our famous ones, Sojourner Truth, escaped from slavery in New York in 1827. Later, she made her home in Battle Creek. As an abolitionist, she made powerful speeches against slavery. After the Civil War, she traveled across the country speaking out for the rights of blacks and women. Take your parents to Michigan's Underground Railroad sites. Detroit. Michigan's first African-American congregation was started at the Second Baptist Church in 1836 by 13 former slaves. Located near the Canadian border, the church was an important stop on the Underground Railroad. A room in the church where slaves hid is now used to teach about the Underground Railroad. Leaders of the abolitionist movement, such as Sojourner Truth, John Brown, and Frederick Douglass, were involved with the church. In 1838, at age 20, Frederick Douglass fled from slavery in Maryland. Through his speeches and writings against slavery, he became a famous abolitionist. Douglass gave an anti-slavery speech at the Second Baptist Church in Detroit in 1859. The Second Baptist Church's address is 441 Monroe Street, just east of the intersection of Gratiot and Woodward in Detroit. So if you're familiar with where the stadiums are, it is right in that area. But now I'm going to have to go and check out the display on the Underground Railroad because I'm very interested. Kalamazoo, Dr. Nathan Thomas House was the home of 2 of Michigan's most active Underground Railroad participants. Between 1840 and 1860, Nathan and his wife Pamela helped more than 1,000 fugitive slaves. Dr. Thomas took the fugitives to Erastus Hussey, who lived in Battle Creek. The Thomas House is at 613 East Cass Street in Schoolcraft. Battle Creek, the Underground Railroad monument, honors the thousands of slaves who risked their lives to find freedom in the North. The man shown in the memorial, right here, is Erastus Hussey. He was a conductor. Erastus and his wife Sarah helped more than 1,000 slaves escape. Harriet Tubman, the woman shown on the memorial, was called the Black Moses because she helped many slaves find freedom. Harriet made 19 trips south, helping 300 slaves escape. During the Civil War, Harriet was a Union scout and a nurse. The Underground Railroad Monument is in Linear Park between Capitol Avenue and Division Street in Battle Creek. While in Battle Creek, you can also visit the Sojourner Truth Memorial, located in Monument Park. Hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about our state's role in the Underground Railroad, which was a very important way to help people get away from a terrible situation with slavery. At this point, you should return to the Google Classroom and complete the assignment. Hope you all have a minute. Meanwhile, Bama P.